Following George Floyd's death, members of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus got together to look at further steps the state could undertake to combat racism and address issues in underserved communities. Their work generally fell into four areas or pillars dealing with education, health, criminal justice, and economic development. During its lame duck session, the Illinois General Assembly approved bills related to three of those areas: education, criminal justice, and economic development, but did not approve the same piece of legislation for health and human service matters. There are various effective dates for the measures contained within these bills. The education reforms are contained within House Bill 2170. The bill requires the State Board of Education, Human Service Agencies, and the Department of Transportation and Central Management Services to report on the racial and ethnic demographics of program participants. Voices for Illinois Children worked with the caucus on this language. The Department of Innovation and Technology is to assist in the effort. Any agency that cannot report by the required deadline must publicly state why. It requires the State Board to annually assess all public school students entering kindergarten. It extends early intervention services for 3-year-olds whose birthday falls between May 1st and August 31st to continue receiving such services until the beginning of the school year. It creates the Whole Child Task Force, which will create measures for equitable, inclusive, safe, and supportive environments in all schools, and it sets new graduation requirements. There are other changes contained in this bill, which you can find on our website. Under the criminal justice reform measures, the legislation abolishes cash bail. A defendant is to be released on personal recognizance if he or she meets certain conditions. The Criminal Justice Information Authority will research current practices in pretrial domestic violence courts. An officer must make a reasonable effort to identify himself or herself and indicate deadly force may be used. An officer may not use deadly force when a reasonable officer would believe there's no imminent threat of death or serious injury, and an officer may not use deadly force regarding a property offense unless the offense is terrorism or such force is otherwise authorized. There's also a requirement that a peace officer must intervene to stop another peace officer in his or her presence from using any unauthorized force. There's no longer a requirement for a sworn affidavit for anyone filing a complaint against an officer. All records regarding misconduct must be retained by a local government. Under the Public Relations Act, employers are not required to bargain about the discipline or discharge of an officer. There are standards regarding the use of body cameras. All communities are to be using them by 2025, with larger communities required to use them by an earlier date. And it makes it an official misconduct to knowingly fail to turn on a body camera when there's a reasonable opportunity to act in a manner consistent with a law enforcement agency's policies. A law enforcement agency employee commits misconduct when he or she knowingly misrepresents facts, and there's an expansion of the circumstances for decertifying an officer. There are also other changes contained in House Bill 3653. Economic reforms are contained within 4 bills passed by the General Assembly. Among them is a 36% interest rate cap on consumer loans. It's now a civil rights violation for an employer to use a conviction record as a reason not to hire, promote, or offer professional development to an individual unless there's a substantial relationship regarding prior offenses, or granting employment to that individual could put a current employee at risk. It increases the goal of awarding total dollars of state contracts from 20 to 30% to businesses owned by minorities, women, and persons with disabilities. State purchasing personnel must complete annual training for diversity and inclusion. It establishes an African Descent Citizens Reparation Commission. That commission is to look at 1. Preservation of African American neighborhoods and communities through investments in business development, home ownership, and affordable housing. 2. Building and development of a vocational training center for people of African descent citizens. 3, ensuring proportional economic representation in all state contracts. And 4, creating and enforcing an Illinois slavery era disclosure bill that would mandate a statement of financial reparations negotiated between the Commission and a corporation or institution that disclosed ties to slavery. It creates a State Community Reinvestment Act, which states that designated financial institutions, chartered or incorporated under Illinois law, have an obligation to meet the financial service needs of the communities in which that institution has its offices, branches, or other facilities. It creates a Commission on Equity and Inclusion to review the state of Illinois' procurement practices, and it adds a new section to the State Housing Authorities Act so that an authority may not evict a leaseholder unless federal law prohibits the individual with a felony conviction from residing at an authority housing facility. There are other changes contained within these bills, which, again, you can find on Voice's website. As for the healthcare and human service reforms the Illinois General Assembly did not approve, Representative Camille Lilly has reintroduced a version of that bill. The bill creates the Racial Impact Note Act, which is a measure Voices for Illinois Children has been working on with members of the General Assembly. It requires Medicaid to cover prenatal doula services and evidence-based home visiting services. It increases the per-patient reimbursement rate for safety net hospitals, requires healthcare professionals to complete training in implicit bias, establishes an anti-racism commission to identify and propose policies to eliminate racism, creates the Medicaid Managed Care Oversight Commission, requires DHS to study how to prioritize state dollars for high violence communities, and it requires licensed daycare home providers and staff to participate in a training session on early childhood social emotional learning, early childhood mental health, and early childhood trauma. The bill makes other changes as well. It's also possible that during the course of the spring legislative session, the General Assembly may take up trailer legislation to deal with those measures approved regarding education, criminal justice, and economic reforms. If the governor were to veto measures approved during the lame duck session, because there is a new General Assembly, that legislation automatically dies.